I just thought I'd introduce myself first. I'm David Burden. I'm the Conservation Director at the National Trust here in New South Wales, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this special event at the National Trust's SH Urban Gallery on suburbia and the housing issues that face us today. We're talking about land use and how we do use the land that we have here. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land here tonight, and it's important to recognise the care and custodianship that those elders past, present and emerging have had on this particular place. But I also think it's important to acknowledge we're speaking about New South Wales more broadly here this evening, and of course that encompasses many Aboriginal people groups. And welcome to anyone who's Indigenous here tonight in particular. This is a conversation, I suppose, about housing and how to fix it. So in 1 hour, we should be able to solve that problem, I think. We've got some very esteemed panellists here, so I'm sure that we'll get through it. It's been prompted by this thought-provoking exhibition called Suburbia Recent Detours, and we're very fortunate that the University of Sydney's Henry Halloran Research Trust Urban Research Initiative has decided to help us run this event. So I thought it's led by Nicole Gurran, who's a Professor of Urban Regional Planning at Sydney University. So maybe, Nicole, could you just tell us a little bit about the Henry Halloran Trust and what your objectives are?
Yeah, thanks so much, David. What a pleasure it is to be here. As David said, I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney, and I direct the Henry Halloran Urban and Regional Research Initiative, which is a cross-university research centre which is dedicated to bringing together the different bodies of knowledge on our university and other universities, you know, from obviously architecture, design and planning, but to art, to politics, to public health, economics, engineering, etc. And to do that in conversation with policymakers, with industry, with practitioners, but much more importantly, with the wider public. And so it was such a great privilege to be able to collaborate with the Urban Gallery on tonight's event, because it really brings together exactly what we're about at the University of Sydney, but also the research initiative, and that is broad-ranging but informed conversations about the problems facing our cities and regions. And what better source for that type of conversation than this exhibition?
Well, thank you, Nicole. And I'll have to put my cards on the table that I did urban design and planning at Sydney University too. So you're outnumbered tonight, Anthony, in terms of the alma maters on the stage. But I just thought it'd be good to introduce to everyone the other panellists here this evening before we get too stuck in. So I probably don't need to introduce this person to you very much, but you've got a very extensive CV. Anthony Burke, Professor of Architecture from the University of Technology in Sydney. And I think Anthony will probably be known best to most of us as the host of Restoration Australia and Grand Design. So we're really fortunate to have you on the panel here this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you about how the past is informing our future, which so much of your work is focused on. We've got Catherine O'Donnell, and I said to her before, I think there's been a conspiracy that all of her works have been put on this particular wall. So there was little choice as to which artist we got, is what she said. Catherine told me, but I think it's fantastic to have Catherine here. She's got an amazing body of work, but it really focuses on these sorts of, the hidden beauty, I suppose, in the suburbs, is fair to say, and that's what I think so many of the works here are focused on, so it's really great to have one of the artists representative. And then finally, I'll just introduce Gavin. Gavin's the curator of this exhibition. And Gavin was telling me before that I think you said this is your 7th exhibition at the SH?
Seventh I presented here, yes.
At the SH Urban Gallery, so that must be some sort of record, so well done. But as a landscape architect and a curator, so many of your works are basic, exploring these themes about the connectedness between landscape and culture. So I just thought we might just start with you a little bit, Gavin, just to explain this exhibition.
Right. Yes, where did it all begin? Well, it was the middle of last year, and I think the conversation was really around the housing crisis and the cost of living, which were interrelated, of course. And I thought, you know, it was getting to a stage where it was a problem, a major problem, and an election was looming. And I thought, well, an exhibition around that sort of idea might be interesting. But I really had to think about that, how I could manage to get this body of work together in such a short time. But the thing that did trigger me was the fact that, you know, we were in a state where housing had become commodified, and, you know, people couldn't find a roof, couldn't find a house to live in, let alone rent a house. And the whole sort of story started to gel, and I felt, where did this happen? How did we get to this impasse? And I realised I had to look back, a bit of a history story here, but 2004, there was a chance the then Liberal government of the day had to take negative gearing off the table. Now, they didn't do it. They didn't do it. So what happened from there in the last 20 years is that we've seen this incredible surge in the property market, and it's sidelined a whole generation of young people. Not just, you know, they've been sidelined to buy a house, and they can't afford the rent to get into a place, to get a roof over their heads. They've been dispersed. And I saw this as a looming tragedy. And I felt, you know, hey, wait a minute. And the thing about this exhibition, I wanted it to be a contemporary event. So I wanted it's not a history lesson. I wanted artists that have the authority, the lived authority of the suburbs, the places they live in, to bring their work to this exhibition. And I had the good fortune to be able to go from Perth to Brisbane to Melbourne to the suburbs of Sydney and as far out as Penrith and up to Wollongong. And it's the quality of the work, you can see it here. It's riveting. And it's, to me, you know, art has a power. There's no question about it. There is a power there. And it's a silent dialogue between the artist and the creation. And when an audience comes to that creation, that's when it starts to work. And I think this is a case where that's happening now around us. And so look, the thing is, 19 artists, working in various medium, across so many different suburban experiences, have come together in this exhibition in suburbia, Recent Detours. So that's been a great pleasure for me to work with Jane Waters, who saw the concept early on and said, you know, we've got to do this. So this is the result of that collaboration and the great work of these very talented artists. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. And yeah. And the nice thing is that the sooner we all stop talking, the sooner everyone can enjoy the exhibition. But in the meantime, I think it is important to have that conversation that we're here for tonight. So I think that the National Trust has, of course, argued since its inception in 1945 that what I'd simplify as keeping the good bits. And I sometimes think we can overcomplicate things. And I always like to remind people that the word heritage, it actually comes, or there's the same roots from, you know, when you inherit something. And when we think about an inheritance, it's usually something that's of value. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be monetary value. I know someone in this room who has a particular inheritance, which was a paperweight, I think it was, which is particularly important in their family. But it's something that's, you know, it might be a watch, it might be a painting, it might be a whole farm or a house. You know, there are all sorts of things we can inherit. But when we actually take possession of them and value them, they're the things that we are trying to protect into the future because we see something with it. So I think that's an important thing to think about when we're talking about heritage. It's the things that are of value to us. And I've argued in the Herald last year, when I suppose this debate was at its fiercest perhaps, and perhaps that Gavin was responding to, that there's not necessarily a question of start again or keep everything, which is how it was actually becoming rather oversimplified. And one of the issues that heritage has is that it has actually protected some really great things and often some really big spaces, and none more so than we're talking about at the moment with the female factory at Parramatta. I always like, and I was talking to a minister recently, but I was actually talking to Bob Carr about it, former Premier, and I was thinking that the Premier at the time, Sir John Robertson, and the Governor at that, back in the 1880s, who decided, let's protect Centennial Park for a city of, I don't know what it would have been then, 500,000 people or something. What a bold vision to have, and thinking into the future. I mean, driving along the M7 at the moment and you're watching them build the extra lane, which should have been built initially, and you compare that to the vision of the Sydney Harbour Bridge that had so many lanes of traffic, 2 lane, trains, trams, when there are only 20,000 cars in the whole state at that time. So it's about thinking ahead, but also having that vision to take that heritage with us into the future. So I sometimes worry that we're going to repeat the mistakes rather than learn from them in the past, and maybe that's one of the questions that we might start with a bit tonight. But I thought what I might try and do is just do a bit of a quick fire question, so we don't have to have long responses initially, but it just gets everyone talking, and then we're actually having more of a conversation. But I thought I'd start with Anthony, and I think basically that people want to live in places that are good and have good amenity. That's what we're actually looking for. It's actually not just creating the house itself, it's actually creating something that's good for people to live in, and that built fabric. So I wonder what your thoughts on our suburbs as these places that have these layers to them, and they're the things that we engage with, and rather than erase as we look to this housing solution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. Thanks, David. It's a big question. I guess the way I kind of frame our conversation here this evening is, as you say, we've been talking about this now for a good 2 years, really fervently for the last 12 months at least. Every headline in the paper that comes out, there's another one every 20 minutes about the solution to the housing crisis, etc. So I kind of think we need to change the frame a little bit. Something about the way we're talking about this is not landing, it's not making change. We're still having the same conversation that we started 2 years ago, I think. So yes, interest rates, yes, it's cost of living, yes, those things are important, they're hard, they're difficult things to talk about, but I don't think they are the only things. And so to your point about the suburbs, I think what we lose sight of in the suburbs is that for many people now, because of the way that we understand our houses, they're not homes anymore, they are houses, they are real estate products. And the last time I looked, we were moving our house, we were moving house every 7 years or so. So that's not really enough time to bed in, it's not really enough time to form community. So when we think about suburbs, I think about the walk up to Main Street, or the local cafe, or the friendly strangers, or that you see every day at the bus stop. That's community, that's the people that you may not talk to, but you recognise them and you feel safe with your people, if you like. You're safe at home. Home there has a much bigger geographic spread than the front door and the couple of bedrooms behind it. So I think in that sense, we're losing that. And the way that we're sort of commercialising or commodifying our homes is taking us away from those connections. The other side to that equation is that our houses have become so big. You all know the stats. We have the biggest houses on average in the world, which is diabolically awful. But saying that, the real physical or psychological impact of that is the loneliness epidemic that follows directly along behind it. So not only in the streets are we further away from each other, or we are not spending the time to get to know each other, but in our own homes, the family unit itself is pulling apart into more and more space, further and further apart. You don't spend time with the kids because there are 6 bathrooms in the house. You don't spend time with the wife because she's in that living room while you're in that living room, or she's in that office while you're in that one over there, and there are 5 cars in the garage. You know the rest of the story. So in that sense, we're kind of building these sort of, I want to say, prisons in a way. That's kind of what it's become. So the way I kind of backtrack on all of this is, our current understanding of house and home is no longer fit for purpose. Whether you put an economic lens on that, a psychological lens on that, a social lens on that, a cultural lens on that, it's broken in every dimension. But we haven't figured out a way to start a different conversation that lets us get out of that loop, out of that spin. So I think that's the kind of thing that this kind of exhibition offers, to me at least. What I see on the walls around us is not that same conversation. It's a bunch of other points of view that will kind of break the discursive cycle, if you like, and just lets us into a different channel of discussion. And maybe that's a great place to start. That's where we start to sort of understand house and home a little bit differently to the way we've been talking about it recently.
I think it's amazing. moving every 7 years, you said.
Yeah, that's the last time I looked. That stat. I'd like to know what it is these days.
Yeah,
but
I mean, one day I'll have to try and get my parents to move, as I think. But I had the same. But I had the same. That we've still got the same neighbours,
Yep.
and they've been there a long time as well. And I know in my particular street, it was you only get in if it was a deceased estate kind of thing. So the neighbour next to me is 1973. The next neighbour to him being there 67. You know, like. So yeah, there is a community that we moved into when we moved there, but that's not happening in a lot of these places.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I thought I'd just then jump over to Nicole, and Anthony's talked about the home, but we're talking about, I guess, with you, with some of these bigger levers that are pulled, and one of the things that always strikes me. I was on the ABC radio, and we were talking about my journey into the city, and I was thinking, well, I caught the same train that had been departing there to get into the city when the line was built in 1887. It's the same train line servicing down to the south coast. And so much of Sydney was actually built on building the infrastructure first. It's no surprise that the North Shore opened up once the Harbour Bridge did. So, I mean, we seem to be doing it a bit in reverse now, is kind of my observation, where we build all the houses and then go, oops. What about, like up at Wilton, there's those huge tanks we drive past, that's to take the sewerage away. We've got a new airport being built without a fuel line leading to it. So how are we, going to solve this problem of building the stuff first and the houses second, maybe?
Yeah, and certainly if you look at the works in this exhibition, you can see that we didn't always get the planning right then either. I'm thinking of Tajette O'Halloran's work, which is documenting young people in Lismore. Looks like the Lismore that I grew up in, but there's a strong theme that runs through this exhibition, which is about spatial disadvantage and isolation, even though some of the works certainly celebrate suburbia with nostalgia. We also have a critique, actually, of the social disadvantage that's associated with, for instance, not having access to public transport, and then the jobs and the social and the recreation opportunities that, so I'm having mic issues, I think, that opens up. But the real irony, I think, at the moment, and the opportunity that art offers us, is actually to jump away from political slogans. But the political slogan right now about solving the housing crisis is just building new supply, with the implication that not only do we not need better planning, but actually it'd be better if we didn't have to plan at all, because then we'd be able to just deliver supply. And that's the political rhetoric. It's not correct, obviously. We do need better planning, and better planning than in the past. But while we're sort of locked in this binary, and obviously we'll talk more about that tonight, I can say, yes, we need better planning, but we're probably, ironically, further away now in Australia than we were, in the 70s and 80s when these places were built.
Yeah, I think Lismore is such an interesting case study, and it's a very crude way to put it, but when you think about Gundagai, where it actually had the issues of flooding and then the whole town was in fact moved, there are these sorts of discussions about places, and the impact of our changing climate on them, and what that might actually mean for something as, a town as big as Lismore now. It's really important. I think the other word you mentioned was nostalgia, and I think there is sometimes a tendency, even on my behalf, to you do sort of have I'm reminded of that Woody Allen movie, is it The Midnight in Paris, where they keep going back in time and everyone wishes they lived 100 years before that. It's sort of, we tend to think that things were better, but not always. But I grew up in a triple-fronted red brick house, and that's obviously shaped me in some way. And Catherine, I was wondering maybe what your growing up was like and how that shaped what we're looking at here.
Yes, well, I grew up in the first grand estate built by the government back in the 1960s, where we had a bit of an overflow with people coming back from the war, post-war, and also the slum clearances in the city. So they were trying to push them out into the suburbs, and they bought land just out 40 k's out of Liverpool and built the first Grand Estate. And that is not the blocks of flats, but houses on sort of your old quarter-acre block, I suppose. And it was promoted as an estate of tomorrow. They actually built a promotional pamphlet to advertise it as the estate of tomorrow, and it's supposed to be an utopian place to go and live. But quickly it became a place that you didn't want to live. So as you were saying about the infrastructure, that was built, the infrastructure came later. And even today there's no train line out there. We had one bus company that used to bus us into Liverpool, or so we could get the train from Liverpool to go to work. Not everyone had cars, not everyone had phones, and you were isolated. When I grew up, I went to school in a little primary school, local primary school. There was 9 kindergartens because that's how many children. And the kindergartens were filled with 35 kids each. So that's how many young people were there going to school. So that you had a high concentration of young people with not much to do. So they all played in the streets, and that's all fine. You'd go to work, but you quickly also became labelled by your postcode. So, as I say, it was Green Valley, and the girls used to be called the Valley Girls, and they knew that 2168 postcode, they didn't really want to go out there. So, but growing up, this is what I was saying before, I didn't actually see all that. My friends were there, my family was there, and I liked being there because I was with them. So there was a community. And that was really important. You could go to the neighbour's house. If we locked ourselves out when we got home, we'd go over and get a butter knife from the neighbour and we'd jimmy the lock open and get through the window and things like that. So there was a strong sense of community, and I remember that. And that was a fibro house that I grew up in. And really, I didn't know it then, but the cladding and the shapes of the cladding and the windows and the doors and how they were on the houses was sort of seared to my brain, and today I still go back to that, not intentionally, it just comes out. I love line, I love abstraction, and I do abstraction with all of my work. So these are things I think that you get as a children. That landscape of my childhood is still there deep down and comes out all the time in the work that I do. And I'm very passionate about the places that I draw and I go to, and it's always public housing. So I'm very drawn to public housing. Even when I've had residencies overseas, I go to the public housing. There's some beautiful homes, of course, and architectural homes, which I absolutely adore, but I don't have the same pull as I do as when I see a fibro house and a wooden window. And for me, that's just where my heart is. So my work is all based around public housing, and I think that's important to me.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thank
And
you.
I think it's it's important to acknowledge, like, there is some fine public housing in Sydney.
Yes.
The Leslie Wilkinson stuff down at Piermont and these sorts of things. There is a real good hopefully, it's something that will come back, and we might get around to that, to have a fine tradition of public housing once again. My first job at the Government Architect's Office was fixing up public housing. It's the thing that we all worked on.
My first job was police houses.
There you go. Yeah. So I think there is something about that does stick with you. Gavin, I just thought we'd just jump to you quickly as well. But you talked about that connection between landscape and culture, and that's very much what we're looking at this exhibition. I was talking to you before about the way that the city does change as well, and there are probably some fine Paddington residents here, and there's a certain demographic that might be associated with that now, but that certainly wasn't the case with the Balmain of 100 years ago and that sort of thing. These places do change, the culture does change. Yeah. I wonder what your thoughts are about this suburbia and how it is changing.
Oh, well, it's very interesting. I mean, you get an artist that has grown up in a suburb like Cherrybrook, and Alan Daniel Jones over here on my left, and he's never really left it. It's a bit like Catherine with her, fibro
right.
world. It was an estate the family moved to in the 80s, and it was an environment that, well, it was a context really that it formed him, and I think that's really interesting because he not only looked at the state of affairs in terms of the rugby heroes and all the different things that were going on around him at Cherrybrook, but it was the deeper past that started to affect him. And, you know, who was here before we were here? That, you know, and then you can see those heads floating in the landscape. They're sort of spirits, really. And he was intrigued by what was there, and it just followed him all that way through his art. Just the spaces the culture, the life he was living, had something else going on, and he's teased that out in his paintings, and it's quite wonderful. And again, it's a pretty ordinary place. Well, when I say ordinary, you'd probably pay a couple of $1 million to have the pleasure of living in one of these today. Anyway, and then there's this idea of high rises. You know, we've got to look at the idea of, well, you know, the number of people that are now living in medium to high density has just grown exponentially. And I was really intrigued to get something of that story into the exhibition, and I think we've done it with the houses around Kingsford that Peter O'Doherty's done, the red brick buildings that were really built, that were builders built forms. There was no architecture involved in any of this, and the idea was to sort of almost eradicate all personality, and it would fit anybody. No one would complain. You got your roof over your head and off you went. Now that's changing. We're starting to come to grips with that now. It's starting to add a little bit of amenity to these places. You might get balconies, you might get courtyards evolving, you might get... And again, it's so important about community. I think this whole idea of without a vital community, a suburb dies. And they do, and that happens. And one of the... and in the high-rise experience, in front of me, but behind all you can see this sort of blandness that affects, you know, what might look like a glamorous view you'll get, but the interiority of living in these places can be very debilitating. And people, they suffer. And we've got to now work out how to fix this, how to get this kind of a mix of housing. And as a landscape architect, I've always thought of context. I've always thought, you know, you've got to bring as much of the environment into the living experience and be able to share that. So, yeah, you know, culture and landscape are very much a part of what I think of when I'm doing exhibitions like this.
Can I just pick up on that?
Please.
So, I mean, just to pick on the point, when looking at the apartments over there, I kind of feel like it's actually, we get caught up in a style game with the architecture. So we're all so deeply attached to the nostalgia of how the home looks. Like you said, you know, the fibro and all the rest of it. So these are images that are so deeply ingrained in us, you know. But I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is one of typology. And when I say that, okay, a little bit academic, but I mean, we're building the same house that we were in the 1950s. So, you know, when Menzies said, okay, you're back from the war, here's a land grant or here's a house, we're basically building exactly the same thing, but it's 70 years, you know, later, and we're still building that damn house, right? But it's just a little bit bigger, and our appliances are a little bit more German. You know, and...
Or Japanese as well.
And now we've got a butler's pantry, you know, if you don't mind me saying. But effectively, it's the same thing. So, you know, I think we're not able to take... For all sorts of really, I guess, obvious and non-obvious reasons, we're not taking the risk to change what a house is to accommodate a current kind of our demographics, the reality of that, as well as our current circumstances. So we've kind of, I think it's really great to sort of see the superficial level, the skin of the buildings, and sort of fall for that romance. And I'm a sucker for that as much as anybody is. But I also think it's behind that. That's where the kind of the DNA needs to evolve. You know, so the way I've been sort of thinking about it is we've got, I think, 20 years of innovation where we have to find the ways we can take the risks, because right now we've de-risked everything to the point where this is all we can build. The skills are gone, the money's not there, the banks aren't lending, and all the rest of it, you know, and of course this is the biggest spend you're ever going to do if it's your house, your family home.
Well,
so the risk is enormous. So how do we help people find a way to step into a space that is a little riskier?
Can I just come in here for a second?
Of course.
Sorry, just butt in on you like that. But I was just thinking, yes, exactly, this is what we're looking at. I'm allowed. I know. But the thing that occurred to me is an initiative like the Nightingale Project, you know, which has taken shape out. I know it's happened in Melbourne and over in Adelaide, but But it has sustainable ideas, and it's a way of mixed use in a building. So you might have 3 or 4 stories, but you don't have any parking. You're right on a transport node. So people don't, bicycles are more important than cars in that situation. Laundries, everyone doesn't need a laundry in their unit. So you have a communal, enough space to do all your laundry, enough machine. Little things like that add to amenity, and they make places affordable, more affordable than they are now. And I think this idea that church land, for instance, hello, look, we're looking at these empty churches, all denominations, just sitting there. You might get half a dozen people on a Sunday. Well, no, it's not good enough. No, let's rethink what these places are all about and transform them into sites. Okay, they're sitting on big footprints. They should be available for some very innovative housing and initiatives which bring in sustainability, low cost, and are not for profit. I think that's the key to where we should be heading.
So how do we do that, Nicole?
Bring it on.
But exactly,
Sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, because I just widen it a bit as well, perhaps, and just my own experience when I was living in Denmark as a student. But there was a high school there during the day. Yeah, 9 o'clock, the students come in. It's a school. 5 o'clock, it was the community college, essentially TAFE. And then everyone was using the same classrooms, but to do night school, all this sort of stuff. And so the building, instead of being open for so many hours, was open for many more. And so it's about not just housing, but in that instance, but it was just using these spaces more wisely. So yeah.
Well, I personally love the idea of church land. I mean, it's not new, obviously, using church land for housing, but the idea of using it simultaneously when it's not being used as a church, I think that's novel and I like it. I'll let you put that forward with the religious institutions, Gavin. But just to take a step back and say, what would be the 5-point plan to fix it? Because design solutions are critical and they fit in the 5-point plan, but first we have to fundamentally fund and, we need structural change in our housing system, and that is actually about policy and about money. The overriding objective, I'm going to give that to Robin Sweeney, her beautiful, modest homes along that wall there that remind us homes are about places that you live in and that you can love. They're the archetypes of the de-commodified or the pre-commodified home. I'm with Gavin. We moved to decommodification in part through tax reform. We make our tax system fairer. The great benefit of not having to subsidise landlords to, provide the existing housing stock at, astronomical rents on uncertain leases is that, not only do you free up money to fund public housing, which is the absolute number one ingredient that we need for structural change. Thanks, Catherine. We've got the illustration behind us. But it also means that landlords aren't outbidding first home buyers, at the auction, And certainly Craig, I think it's Craig Handley's work. I've probably got his name wrong. Is it Craig Handley? But, when we look at these, and many of us grew up in this idyllic suburbia here, when our parents bought their home, they weren't competing.
The above ground pool, you see, very interesting.
Beautiful. But, so we take that out of the market, we fund social housing. We move to more innovative tenure models, as Gavin says, that give us the idea and the security of home, but not the asset. We work out how to use our existing housing stock. I don't think the answer is only in building new homes. And if we ever wanted, a warning about that, it's Adrian Doyle's failed suburban dream. It's literally a McMansion, probably 30 years old. It's an abandoned, symbol of suburban alienation, whatever you like. But it's true. We need to retrofit the suburbs, and we need to build in ways that are not only more sort of socially sustainable but also environmentally sustainable. And that takes me to my very favourite work in this piece, which is Address Unknown, and that is that composite of 100 photos of houses in Lismore that are to be demolished. Essentially. 99, thank you. Maybe one isn't being demolished, but 99 homes, amazing. But yet, that photo composite is so abstracted, but we can read it intimately, or at least anyone who grew up in Lismore can read it. It just takes us right back to what Catherine said about our very subconscious, the recesses of our mind, being formed by the fabric of the homes that we grew up in, and we've forgotten all of that and why that's so important. If we just listen to the news and the policy prescriptions.
And I mean, Lismore is the case in point there. But so often you now see a house that just says sold, and you just think that's probably the last time I'll see that house. In Sydney, as you're driving past it, you know what's going to happen, the McMansion, and it's. And I think they're really interesting points. I also, something that struck me as well when we were talking about the biggest houses, but also the density that existed historically in places like King's Cross, it's almost being inverted. So they were the smallest apartments are actually all being consolidated to make larger apartments. So the density is becoming less in our densest suburbs. And in the spaces where we have more space, even within a house, people are now further away. There's this.
Can I just add to that?
Big inversion.
This rhetoric that we read about in the newspaper and we see on TV, we need more supply, as though Australia's housing problem is a lack of housing. Actually, our problem is a lack of access to housing. Too few people have too many homes, and too many people don't have housing at all, and that's really the nub of the problem that we need to address.
I've had 2 conversations with people in the last 12 hours who are in the 30 to 38-year-old bracket.
It's a good bracket.
It's a great bracket.
Wish I was.
And both were about this, and they both said that they went to 12 open houses on last weekend, and they both finished the sentence with, and I think we are totally effed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the sense of an entire, decade, generation is like, we just don't have a play in this. There is no space in here for us. I don't know how to move forward in this. I'm trying my best. I'm out there hunting. I'm doing the rounds with the real estate market.
I've got a job.
But I'm screwed. Yeah, I've got a job. I've worked hard. And that's that hopelessness, or that sense of, there is no alternative.
Well,
here.
wouldn't you say that's
what worries me.
Excuse me. That's bringing on a completely dysfunctional society.
That's right.
I mean, if the gold standard of a secure investment is another house, then it's nothing. We're not going to ever fix this because that's where people want it. That's where they're going, and so we've really got a situation where we've got a society that's going to be characterised, I guess, by a sense of greed and indifference, and I think that's where we are now.
Do we burn it all down? As the Bunnings factory.
Bunnings, yes.
Had to get Bunnings.
The
Did you all get past
approach.
Bunnings on the way in? I'm afraid, oh gosh.
Maybe we're even going back to the 3-bedroom house. Maybe that, if you live in Northbridge and Willoughby and those areas, where you're knocking down a big house and building 9 townhouses, maybe we're going back to these small places. I don't know, my sons don't like housework, they're too busy looking at airplanes, they don't like gardening. I think we could go back.
My kids too.
20 years' time, are we just looking at the future?
But also, I would just like to say, do you then need to squash that dream of home ownership as being successful, like you're a success because you own your own home, and then you have to shift that to owning your home is not being successful, but just surviving in some of the other contexts, living in a rental is still okay, because we do have that image that, if you rent, when are you going to buy a house?
It's a stage.
Yeah, it is, and we've got such pressure because we've got children that are of ages to buy a house, and I would say the same thing. They go to open homes and there's so many people there and they walk away despondent. They say, what are we going to do? And also people are offering over the
Of course.
price, so they've got no chance. They go in and they think, okay, I've got this much I can spend and have $1 million mortgage and I can get the house, but someone has offered 200,000 over. And so I just feel like maybe don't make it so important to own a home. You've got to diversify what you do and your money, look at it a different way and live a life rather than sort of just existing.
I'm sure Nicole would talk on that, but I'm thinking of I obviously have 2 sets of grandparents, like most of us, but one owned their house, but the other in the UK, that wasn't the thing. And I remember in fact, my grandfather was offered to buy his council house, but actually declined that offer at the time and just said, no, I'd just like to keep renting our council house. But it was that access to housing. It was his house. They weren't going to move him out. It was just that. So it was kind of, it was a different mindset perhaps in that instance.
I would like to say something on that because we've got the lead up to the election and we've got one political party saying ostensibly they're all about home ownership, but the policy that they're putting forward, which is, there's 2, but one of them is accessing super to help people move into home ownership. Now that's obviously counterproductive, and the other policy, well, it's not a housing policy, but it's all very well, I think, for us to say, and in fact that same party, I think a decade ago, did say to people, oh, well, get comfortable with renting if you need to. But we can't really say that in Australia because our whole social and economic system is predicated on people moving into home ownership by retirement. And even, the tax system disadvantages you or advantages you so much if you're a property owner. So, not to mention the fact that our private rental sector is so precarious and is absolutely not a genuine alternative to ownership. So if we want to say, and I think you're right, one of the solutions is actually to look at different types of tenure and maybe home ownership as we've understood it, or property ownership as we've understood it, shouldn't necessarily be the dream. But we then need to structurally change some things in our housing system to provide alternatives to home ownership that are affordable, that involve secure long-term tenures in homes that are, genuinely suited to our needs, not to mention the environment. And that does look like a social and affordable housing system, such as in the UK. It involves our governments, for instance, being much more involved. Once again, they were very involved actually in the 60s and the 70s in funding and laying out land and housing development. We can see more of that, certainly the non-profits, and I'm all there for the church land.
But I think it's also very interesting. The other side of the equation is about the actual materials that it takes to build our houses. When they're getting bigger, we're using more stuff to build them. And one of the key features of after the war was the restrictions on materials and the economy of scale, and making sure that the materials that were available and the labour that was available was directed to the biggest results. So I'm also just thinking, maybe I'll ask Anthony this, but it's something you talked about before, about what it means and how it's shaping us. But I sort of think of that Winston Churchill quote that we all know, that we shape our buildings and then they shape us. When you are, and I don't just mean choosing the Doric facade, the Tuscan facade, the whatever on your latest Masterton. How do you think this housing issue is shaping us, I suppose, going forward? Yeah, you started to touch on it, I think, but
yeah. That's the big question. I totally hear what you're saying, Nicole. I do agree that we have so much to do with the politics of the moment, demand action and response, and some kind of clear strategic move that we need to make. But like I was saying before, I think the rhetoric is sort of bound up in itself. We've got to step into a new zone somehow. For me, it's a bit like the sustainability issue. We had the science in the 60s, we kind of had the technology in the 90s. Now it's a question of hearts and minds. We've just got to do it. We know how to do it, we're just choosing not to do it just yet. All the science is in, the technology is in, we know how to do it, but we're choosing not to. I think it's a bit the same with the housing. So in that sense, and houses are always emotional first and rational second. So we can talk about the rational sort of response to policy and to banks and to interest rates and all of those things, but if we can't take that big Australian cultural ship and turn it just gently into a couple of different harbours that might understand that house might mean a little something different, or renting might be actually cool, or there's a different model, a different opportunity there. If we can't do that, then all the structure and all the policy in the world's not going to save us, because we'll keep coming back to that same cultural kind of meme, and that's what we'll just sort of default to. So that's my worry here, and that's why I think it is really a question of hearts and culture first. Now, how do we communicate that to a very broad audience? Well, we're all doing our very best. The National Trust is doing an amazing job. I know there's a lot of experts in the audience. We're all doing our best to get the message out there, but I don't think we're making a dent in it just yet. So we've got to find a better sort of platform of sorts for advocacy to, again, move the needle somehow, just a little bit. That'll be enough just for now, I think.
David, can I ask
Please.
Gavin and Catherine about the role of art in that? Because obviously that was my interest from Halloran in running this event, because to my mind, I'm so frustrated with actually the lack of progress through didactic, means and policy prescriptions and talking, quite frankly. And to me, art actually allows us to open our emotions, and it asks the viewer to do the work for themselves. But I'm just curious about Gavin and Catherine's perspectives on that.
No, well, it's interesting you mentioned Robin Sweeney's works from the Northern Rivers, an artist who, well, first of all, I think it's the authority an artist brings to the subject, that they have spent an enormous amount of time examining and feeling. It's about feeling as well, and that comes through in the work. And I think that transmission of emotion, you could see it in Robin's work, in those houses, those modest houses they're perched up there in the Northern Rivers from Brunswick Heads, or some of them are in Mullumbimby, some of them are in Ballina, but they are endangered. And this is what Robin is so concerned about. She's been looking at these houses for 30 years. She has a great affinity for them. She understands the scale. She understands how they work within a context. They're not on their own. And this sense that she had seen, she's been able to show us a vernacular model that the Southerners moving into these areas want to get rid of, because they don't fit into their story of how you live. They want to bring their 10 bedrooms, four bathrooms, 6 cars, so they have to go. And it's changing. The fabric and the society that lives in these places are being challenged. Now, art has a way of saying, stop for a minute and look. Have a good look. And that's all. And that's what it does. And then questions are raised. Answers aren't necessarily given, if ever, but the questions are raised. And I think that's really one of the things that I find, that moves me when I see a work of art that, like Catherine's showing us here, that works of substance that gets you intrigued, involved, and then you go deeper into it. And I think that's, and that's how all this work in this exhibition has come together, because it has, as the curator, my job is to put together a composition, a cohesive composition. And I hope that that's what you're seeing here tonight, because that's my job, and that's what gives me a great amount of satisfaction when it comes off. So there you go.
I'll jump to you, but I think that's really important, the fact that this is a contemporary exhibition of it. It's not like looking at L.S. Lowry's work in the UK over the industrial in that time, or John Brack's Melbourne 5 o'clock. We sort of nostalgia, but this is now. This is what we're actually. So yeah, Catherine,
it's an exhibition of living artists.
Yes,
yes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
19 living artists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I bet you're glad to hear that.
I was.
Yes.
Check. It's good. No, but I think you're absolutely right. And Robin's work, and that's something that I look at with my own work too, that when you look at these places, you've got to look beyond the surface. And while I talk about a certain time and place, I'm talking about the top politics of the time, the politics that still go around now, and the history of the people that lived there. So it's multi-layered. All these places, they're multi-layered. And like the ones with Robin's, of course, my favourite ones are Fibro. And fibro, everyone knows, is asbestos, and of course if you have an asbestos house they just want to knock that down straight away and rebuild it. There's whole suburbs. Asbestos, I think fibro was one of the major building materials post-war, because they couldn't get the bricks and
it
all
was
the rest
fireproof
of it.
and had all these other qualities.
That's right. It was
but
great until they discovered asbestos. So there's a whole rich history behind that people can think about when they look at the work. So that's important for the artist to have that there. And as you say, we don't write a big essay to say that's what the work's about, but if you look beyond the surface and think about what you're looking at, there's a rich history behind it, and they're saying something.
Now, I'm conscious of the time, and I'm more than happy if there's anyone in the audience with a burning desire or a question, that I'm sure our panellists would be, and I just wanted to make sure. So yes, you might just yell out a bit. But
very quickly, I mean,
yes.
Australians fixated on immigration, most of the room can attest to that.
Yep.
But it seems like the fact that we've got most of the immigration, this is a very proper question, is ending up in Sydney or Melbourne. We've got two premiers that are at war with their suburbs, saying you're going to have 4 stories and 8 stories within 400 metres, and that sort of attitude, rather than the ideas that you're talking about of new ways to get people to live on the land, or the old-fashioned word of decentralisation. Whatever happened to decentralisation? Why is Sydney and Melbourne having continually do the heavy lifting on the increased numbers?
Yeah.
This panel must be able to answer that.
Yeah, please go.
No,
Actually, I should give it
no,
to Liz Morgan. Well, no, because I actually forgot to say that in my list of 5 points for a structural change. Actually, regional decentralisation is absolutely on the list, and we saw during the COVID period. But actually, my team's done research that shows even prior to COVID, there was a movement towards the regions, and in fact, more people leave Sydney and Melbourne for the regions than move from the regions to Sydney and Melbourne now. The impact is masked a little bit because the cities are continuing to grow from international migration, but that's absolutely the case, that regional migration is important. I think also you've picked up on the other thing that's sort of staring at us in this exhibition, which is this binary between either suburbia or soulless towers. And actually listening to Catherine talk about the meaning of home for you helps us understand why people feel so invested in the suburbia that they grew up in and hate the idea of that changing and sort of fear towers. And we haven't really been able to put forward a viable alternative such as the townhouses. But I just have to say one thing about immigration in the context of this really unproductive conversation that we're having. It's first and foremost unproductive because it's not going to fix the housing problem if we keep on saying, oh, let's just change our migration settings, that we're just not going to fix it. But we know that migration doesn't drive high house prices, because we saw during COVID period when our migration went backward, house prices went up further than they've gone since our borders have been open. And the other thing is that even international students, which probably make up the greatest volatility in terms of international migration, the dwellings that they use and the way that they use dwellings is very different to normal housing demand, and we actually don't even count in our dwelling numbers purpose-built student housing. So, it's very important to, population growth and change absolutely drives the need for rental housing in particular, so we need to understand it. But if we keep talking about cutting migration as though that's going to fix the housing problem that we have in Australia, we are not going to fix it.
I think, just my observation on that as well is, I was reading the other day Beverly Kingston's History of New South Wales, but in the 20s, there was, in terms of the biggest towns, it went Sydney, Newcastle, Broken Hill, followed by Cessnock and Goulburn.
Wow.
Fast forward 100 years, we would never have, I don't think anyone would have guessed that. I certainly didn't when I read it. I'm wondering what, things could change. Maybe there will be places that are bigger in 100 years' time, I don't know. But it is an interesting thing to consider. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that, or I'm happy to ask other questions?
Got a question.
Yeah. Another question? Maybe Anthony, you might speak on that, given your earlier comment about the 7 years and people moving? How might that demographics fit into?
There's no particular policy that I'm aware of that sort of really targets a demographic like that. But, I'm thinking as you're talking about things like the fear of people the kids have left, the empty nesters, maybe one of the partners has passed, and then there's the fear of actually letting go of the big house because it's the financial rock that their life is built on. So the security that house represents is just way too precious to give up for any kind of change. A smaller house, even though it makes financial sense, just the change is way too fearful. So that's at that end, of the sort of the demographic spectrum. The only other category that we have is then the first home buyer. And that's not necessarily an age, it's just an entry in. Oh, I understand where you're going, but there's no kind of policy in particular that I'm aware of around sort of catering to those groups.
To the actual demographic.
There are different developers and so on that will aim for a particular kind of demographic to a point. But the fact that I think is that those kinds of products are all very much vanilla. They're all the same, effectively. So the difference between, let's say, a 30 to 45-year-old housing versus a 50 to 70 housing, it's not much in that, Maybe there's a few less stairs in this one, but they're kind of like it's pretty much the same thing because that's what the construction industry will deliver. That's what they know how to deliver, and that's where the mechanisms are all set up. As Nicole's talking about, that's the system that's ready to deliver that kind of stuff. And, I think the whole irony here is that we're going to fix the housing problem by just building more of the same houses that are already the problem, And I find that a problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think as well, sometimes now there seems to be a little bit of a move towards when there's uniblock, making sure there are some 3 bedrooms as opposed to everything being 2-bedders and stuff. So there are some
like
policies that are starting to shift that way, maybe, and that maybe caters for that demographic question. Certain homes are bigger than others.
It's kind of minor.
But it is. But it's the start of maybe some of that conversation.
Great question.
If we move to a system of development or even rehabilitating the housing that we've got and retrofitting the existing housing stock, we would want to do that with in mind the sort of full spectrum of housing needs, and that spectrum is your stage in life, your level of ability, disability, your cultural needs, your household type, and as well as the affordability of the product. We can do it. It's doable. It does involve good design, especially when we're talking about retrofitting the very homogenous housing stock that we still have in Australia, and it's absolutely about good design for new housing. As Anthony says, we're not doing it, it's not baked into our policy settings, but it very, very well could be. And we need to address the affordability of that too, but again, there are models to do that.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah,
I've been dying to tell you this anecdote. I was at the Bill and Ruth Lucas Glass House all day today filming. And it's such a great...
It won a National Trust Award last year.
National Trust Award. Do you want to David, tell us about that?
No.
And it deserved to. A beautiful restoration. Cracknell Lonergan did an amazing job. So beautiful little home. And if you know the home, it's this lightweight timber, super thin timber on steel in Castle Crag. It's tiny, and it was actually built with no doors between any of the rooms, and they could sort of pull up and put down partition walls between 2 bedrooms, make it into 3 bedrooms, change it into 2 bedrooms again, make the master bigger if they wanted to. The flexibility was in the plan because it was so rational and so sort of elegant in all of its dimensions. And I think, God, they were doing that in 1957. And they were just left Sydney Uni when they were doing it, and they were doing it because Bill had he had some kind of payment after the war. He had some return servicemen repatriation. So he had just enough money for him and Ruth to kind of get together and have a crack at this thing, and they built it, and it's still standing, it's still looking great, and it's still serving now a new family who are in there who have 3 kids. There are still no doors on the bedrooms, and it's working a charm. Yeah. So I think, there are, like you say, there are models out there. I want to see more of that kind of brave thinking and. Yeah.
And Bill Lucas, he did a really great solar house down in Sylvania. It's now been demolished, but he wasn't just thinking about that. He was thinking about the sun in these earlier times, and that's what we need. I could see there was one sort of maybe a final question that we might.
I was just thinking. So I come from an interest of transportation planning, and thinking about this thing called induced demand that we get in that sphere. I'm thinking that politicians want to build more houses, Transport wants to build more of the same thing, which is usually roads and lanes and things like that, but then they're not scoping in those sorts of things. Is it a similar issue happening across those two spheres? Is there reduced demand? I'm not sure, for housing. You build more houses, and you've already talked about it a little bit because you were saying that we have the supply of houses, just not distribution of houses. So maybe building the houses isn't necessarily the remedy, and we need to sort of think about the distribution. But I'm just trying to relate in this idea of reduced demand to housing.
Is it an oversimplification to give that analogy where you have a 2-lane road and then you add another lane and then you add another lane, but it's still always congested? Is that kind of what you're... Yeah. So is building more housing actually going to solve... Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Let me pick that.
Yeah.
I want to clarify when I say we don't have too few houses in Australia. Our housing stock has enough for all of us. You know, we've got run about 10% vacancy. We still do need new housing construction. We need, growth and change. Even if our population stayed static, the problem with that is that it's not enough. So all we hear politicians at the moment talk about is we need to build more supply as though that's going to fix the affordability problem. It won't, it's not enough. But yes, we still do need more homes to be built, but they need to be built in ways that are sustainable, that meet the population needs, and that also the people who are missing out at the moment are able to afford them. But to give you a transport answer, one of the solutions that's floated often by planners and policymakers might be, say, let's look at Nix and Torres. We've got to give these artists the say in this conversation. I read Nix, suburban, dystopia there, as an example of car-dependent suburbia and isolation. One of the housing strategies potentially, and certainly to regional areas as well, is to improve transport and infrastructure. I'm on board with that. I think that's a great thing, especially if it's not, more roads. The issue is when we do that in Australia, we don't do it in ways that also preserve affordability. So, one of the housing solutions can be infrastructure, transportation. We're seeing it in Sydney, but we need to make sure that we are still providing affordable homes when the property values rise because of the improved transport accessibility and amenity.
So just to add to what Nicole just said, I think I'm right to say when you said 10%, what Nicole said was 1 million dwellings were vacant on census night in 2021.
That's correct. Yeah. And it hasn't changed really.
And there are many reasons for that, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean vacancy in the housing stock, it's not necessarily a problem, but it tells us that. Yeah. But it tells us that we don't have a shortage of homes.
And that has been one of the things that the National Trust has been saying from the outset of this argument. It's like, let's look at what we have and maybe reassess its use because there is so many vacant dwellings in the city.
Ian Strange, his photographs at the start of the exhibition, just about this very issue. It was a housing estate that was just demolished, and we go about demolishing lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's...
well, look, I've heard the champagne jingling. The ice has been released. But I would like to thank everyone. Firstly, thank you to all of you for attending. It's wonderful that when there is an event put on and people go to the effort of putting it on, that it's a full house. So thank you very much for coming. And I think if we could just thank all of our panellists for coming along as well.